I'm just going to give them, I'm just going to give it a minute or so for people to trickle in. I'll just give 30 seconds for people to have their audio hook up. It's good to see everybody. Looks like we still have some that are showing up. All right, I'm going to get started. All right, welcome everybody to NCJW Lunch and Learn. And my name is Nicole Gorofsky. I am one of the hosts of the NCJW Lunch and Learns. And I want to welcome today, a very happy welcome for Sarah Fenske. Many of you know Sarah Fenske from our local community. She served as the host of St. Louis on the Air from 2019 to 2022. And before that, she spent 20 years in newspapers, working as a reporter, a columnist, an editor in Cleveland, Houston, and Phoenix, Los Angeles, and St. Louis. She won the Livingston Award for Young Journalists for her work in Phoenix, exposing corruption at the local housing authority. She also won numerous awards for column writing, including multiple first place wins from the Arizona Press Club, the Association of Women in Journalism, and the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. Just to let you know, Sarah's here today to talk about some of the evolution in our local news. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm very honored to be here today. When Nicole asked me if I do this, I was like, well, of course I do it. Why do you want me to do it? I was very easily talked into it. It's nice to have a platform to talk about something that I'm really wound up about at all times, which is local news. Now, I've spent my entire career in local news, and that's pretty unusual for someone my age. A lot of people who are eager to get into journalism, they opt out because they want to make more money, or they get flushed out because as much as these are hard jobs to get, they're really hard jobs to hold. You know, as I look back on the 24 years that I've spent in local journalism, I kind of think that my greatest achievement is that I haven't been laid off even once. I don't know that many people my age can say that. I think of my theme song as the beginning of Aladdin, where he sings he's one jump ahead of the breadline, one leap ahead of the sword. I just feel like I'm constantly trying to like zig and zag and pivot just because I like want to keep doing this job that I love doing so much. And, you know, other people haven't been as lucky in that. And so today I'm going to talk to you about local news, but I want to start with a personal anecdote. And I swear there's a point to this. I met my first husband, my now ex-husband, because we were covering the same city council for rival daily newspapers. So I was 22 years old and I was working in a daily newspaper in Lorain, Ohio. Now, you guys have probably never heard of Lorain, Ohio. There's no reason you should know of Lorain, Ohio. We used to call it jokingly, but accurately, the armpit of America. And so I'm right out of college thinking, oh, I'm going to go to New York City. I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. Well, the job that I got was in Lorain. And not only did I have to drive to this gritty steel town to take this job, but then they took one look at me and they're like, yeah, you're not gritty enough. We're going to send you to the suburbs, our fast growing suburbs of Avon and Avon Lake, Ohio. And so my job was to cover pretty much anything that was happening in these two little suburbs. I would go to the planning commission. I would go to city council. I would go to the school board meetings. I was honestly often just looking for things to cover. I remember once, one of the high school choirs was going to go sing at Carnegie Hall in New York City. And I thought, oh man, I wrote a feature story about this, and this little daily newspaper I was at put me, sorry, I see a comment here. Does somebody know Lorain? I'm distracted. Oh, for the people who live there, it is home. That's absolutely right. And that's part of what I'm going to get at in this. Is that it was hard for me coming in as an outsider, trying to understand why was I in the middle of this town. But as I got to know this town, there were people in this town that cared deeply about everything going on in this town. And so when this choir went to Carnegie Hall, we made this front page news and people were so happy. We had a picture of their kids who were going to go sing in New York City. So it was an adjustment for me. I had been thinking in college that I was going to go to law school. And then I ended up falling in love with the campus newspaper. I ended up deciding that I was going to do my thesis on Woodward and Bernstein. I had all these visions in my head of what I was going to do with my life. Here I was in Avon and Avon Lake. And there was one thing that kind of put a spring in my step. And that was that there was a handsome 30-something reporter for the Chronicle Telegram. This was the rival newspaper. And so we would be there covering city council meetings and kind of having a little flirtation between items. We ended up having this secret romance. My editor even called me into his office when he found out, oh, I was dating the guy from the Chronicle Telegram. He threatened to fire me if I ever lost out on a scoop because I was doing a favor to this guy that I was interested in. And I thought, he doesn't know me at all. If he thinks that I'm going to give a scoop up to this guy's going to give me the scoop up. But that's how seriously we took this competition, because we understood that to this town, what we were covering was of utmost importance. So we ended up getting married. Soon after that, he quit journalism for PR. I got promoted. I ended up covering City Hall in Lorain. It was a great job. Loved doing that. I wasn't in the suburbs. I was in the big city. And now as I look back on that period of my life, what strikes me the most is this. We had 2 reporters covering suburban city council meetings. There were 2 of us. And that competition, and it was definitely competition. Neither of us were stepping back to the other one. It made our coverage stronger. If I decided to sit on a story because I was friendly with somebody that it reflected poorly on, he would have that story. So I knew I couldn't sit on that story. If I was shading things for whatever reason or didn't quite understand what was going on, he might well get the more full version of that. It made our coverage better because it kept us honest. And I can tell you this, that doesn't happen anymore in towns like Lorain, Ohio. I'm going to give you a couple statistics. U.S. newsroom employment has fallen 26% since 2008. Newspaper employment fell 57% in about 10 years. That was before the pandemic. I wasn't able to find accurate statistics that followed the pandemic. I can tell you a whole lot more newspaper reporters lost their jobs. And in many ways, my generation is the hardest hit. The number of full-time mid-career newsroom employees, these are people aged 35 to 54, that dropped 42% in the last decade. Some days I feel like the only experienced local journalist still standing who's not just counting down to retirement. And let me tell you this, there's a whole lot more that I know now about how to cover local government than I knew when I was 22 years old, and making a lot of pretty obvious mistakes. And the town of Lorain gave me a lot of grace in that. I needed to learn my job. Now that I know my job, there's not very many people like me still out there. So what does that mean for democracy? Well, I think that's the really serious part here. I may have been covering what I thought of as a backwater suburb, but there was corruption in this town. You know, I wrote some stories about the mayor funneling city money to his brother's business. It wasn't a lot of money, but I think he was kind of testing the waters, seeing what he could get away with. Well, he ended up going to jail because of those stories. And these days, when there's nobody covering city council in that kind of suburb, I think he'd probably get away with it. Do you guys remember the stories about rank corruption in the town of Bell in Southern California? This is a place near Los Angeles. And the LA Times had stopped sending reporters to Bell. And so officials started realizing nobody was paying attention to what they were doing. And they just pillaged this town for years before it got so bad that finally a whistleblower put together a whole packet of information and managed to interest the LA Times in again paying attention to this town and coming back to cover it. They ended up exposing corruption. A ton of people went to jail. The people of Bell got the kind of reforms that they deserved. Well, that was in 2010. You know, since then, the Los Angeles Times and most other major metro dailies have pulled back even farther on local news coverage. They're not sending people to Bell anymore, even if they briefly did. And I can't help but think how many Bells are out there right now. We sometimes think of this as a rural problem, and there are indeed real problems with not having enough reporters to cover rural America. But if we look at the last 15 years, 70% of the newspapers that have closed were located in metro areas. These are the smaller weeklies that used to pay attention to places like Avon or Avon Lake. A lot of them were even just the loss of jobs at larger papers. The paper's still there, but it no longer has enough people to cover the news. I think about George Santos. You know, you have a guy who was a party nominee for a major party. He's running for Congress. He had a chance at winning. He did win. And somehow nobody realized until after the election that his entire resume was fraudulent. Now, it turns out there was one small paper in that area that broke one tiny piece of this, and they did good work. And I give them props for managing to do that. But the fact that people wouldn't have been dissecting his resume back in the day that I was in Lorraine and feeling like this, oh, this was so hard and had to find some news. Of course, if somebody was running for Congress, we would have scrutinized what their resume said, and we would have found the holes in it, and it would have been something voters could know before the election. It's not just these major investigative stories either. It's the mastery of a beat. It's the idea of, we're going to pay a 22-year-old reporter so she can go to these planning commission meetings and she can learn. And, you know, you come in so uneducated, but after a couple of years and sort of these small town officials who take their time to sort of walk you through how things work, you start to realize how things work and how things don't work. I was talking to the great columnist Bill McClellan the other day. I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with Bill. He's just one of the nicest, funniest guys in town, just a great reporter and just such a generous person with other people in the industry. And he was telling me how Post-Dispatch reporters used to make fun of TV reporters. This is something that print people like to talk about. You know, they're all better looking than us. And so we have to find the ways of sort of like having one up on them in whatever way we can. We like to pretend we're smarter. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but Bill said that he would go out to like a crime scene or a big public meeting, and the TV news reporter would show up and they'd be like, hey, fill me in, what's going on? And Bill said, you know, we'd tell them the basics just to be nice. We wouldn't tell them everything. We were going to hold back the good stuff for ourselves. But they thought it was really funny that these TV reporters were all general assignment. They would get their assignment, you know, that day. They had to go out, cover what happened, get their story done by that night, and then the next day they'd move on to the next story. The Post-Dispatch didn't operate that way. They had people who would cover just one police department, and they would just cover that day in, day out, had all kinds of sources, knew exactly how things were supposed to go. Bill said to me, he said, now we're just like those TV news reporters. You know, I mean, the Post-Dispatch, they still do a great job. They have a ton of good journalists, but think about this. They have one person covering education throughout the entire metro. I mean, we have 92 municipalities. I can't even hazard a guess of how many school districts we have. You can't go to all those school board meetings, even if you tried. What you end up doing is you see where the outrage is exploding. You try to get in time to explain what's happening. You write the story, you see how it blows up further, then you got to move on to the next thing. You know, I know the woman who covers education for them. She's doing a great job. This is no skin off her back, but that is an impossible beat to master. And in some ways, as Bill pointed out, we're all just covering the big story of the day. You know, Wildwood, people are behaving badly there towards Black administrators. We're all rushing in. We got to cover this. Well, the people who are behaving badly know that we're going to be there and we're going to cover this and we're all going to move on. They're just waiting us out. It didn't used to be that way back in the day. There aren't enough people with subject matter expertise. And so here's the thing about the absence of local journalism or the decline of local journalism. And that is that into the vacuum comes fake news. Now, you guys all know fake news. You see it every day whizzing past you on social media, I'm sure, if your feed looks anything like mine. And in some cases, you know, we're talking about national, international politics. This is Russian disinformation. That's been proven. But on a local level, it can also just be, I heard from a friend of a friend. And it might be somebody who's ill-informed and just putting something out there and other people are sharing it and repeating it and it's metastasizing and it's unverified and it takes off on Facebook or it takes off on Twitter or it just takes off spreading word of mouth. You know, my nephew, God bless him, he's a South County kid, works at a gun store, grew up in a family where they watch a lot of Fox News. He doesn't even watch Fox News. He gets all of his news from social media. I think he's primarily on TikTok. And he became convinced that schools were letting kids use litter boxes in the classroom because these kids had supposedly identified as animals. And you can kind of see where this story is going, in whose interest it is to sort of allow this rumor to spread and keep repeating it. And so I looked into this. I said, Jacob, like, this cannot be true. Sure enough, there have been several stories debunking this, but this is a rumor that has spread in many towns across the nation, where people just keep repeating this as if it's true, as if there's some substance to this. My nephew is all wound up about it. He's kind of deciding who he's going to vote for based on this thing that he hasn't even bothered to fully research. And it's convinced him because it fits his way of seeing the world. Talk about fake news. Now, this is a scary thing, not just because this news is fake, although that's obviously a huge problem, but it's also because the spread of these over-the-top stories that are designed to provoke outrage directly undermine the funding model for journalism. You know, not everybody wants a pile of leaves from a dead tree delivered to their door anymore. And, you know, these days, if you want that delivered to your door, it's increasingly hard to get it to show up. The newspaper delivery model is broken on top of everything else we're dealing with. So we're all dependent on online advertising. We work really hard to get your eyeballs onto our story, and then advertisers pay us for the privilege of connecting with you. Now, in the old days, you might read a story about the St. Louis City Council and you'd see this big page of bra ads from Macy's. Do you guys remember that? Like, they used to really have a lot of bra ads in the daily newspaper. Well, God bless Macy's for running those ads. Like, they were underwriting local journalism. That really helped all of us. Now you see a story about the St. Louis City Council online, and you might see a little ad for whatever you just browsed on Amazon and decided not to actually buy, and it now follows you all around the internet. That gives us revenue, and that's great, and we'll take it. But here's where things get complicated, is instead of lingering over that story the way you might have done when it was there next to the bra ads, you're distracted by what your high school ex-boyfriend has just posted on Facebook. And you're looking at this and you're going, where does he come up with this stuff? This is not, you know, what was I ever thinking to date this guy? Or you're seeing somebody has posted some tabloid story about what one of the Real Housewives is up to in New York City. You're reading the story about city council that someone has labored over. You're maybe reading that for 30 seconds. And then you're like, whoa, look over here. And so that's obviously a huge problem when we're dependent on the advertising of you spending time on our site. It's also a huge problem for you and your understanding of local affairs, which can sometimes be the least sexy and yet very important things to be paying attention to. So we're competing not just against other local outlets, but we're competing against every single outlet that is online and vying for your eyes and time. And that's less civic education for you. It's fewer ad dollars for us. So this is all very depressing. I feel like I haven't said a single thing so far as I've been talking to you that isn't just sad and unfortunate. And I like to believe that there are solutions for things. And I like to believe that there is a solution for local journalism. So I've got a couple things that all of us can do, or at least maybe think about doing. Maybe I can help change a little bit of your perspective on some of this stuff. Or maybe if you have a nephew in your family who believes the cat litter story, maybe I can help arm you with some tools to help him. I think the number one thing you can do, and I want to thank one of your members. I was out Saturday night having a few drinks and I got to meet one of the women who's a part of this council, and we got to talk briefly, and she had this great piece of advice. I said, what should I tell people to do about this problem? And she said, encourage people not to engage with dubious sources. When Facebook is serving up some story that is designed to just trigger your outrage, and it's coming from a media outlet that you've never even heard of, why would you want to engage with that story? You know, you might think you're sort of doing a service by getting in the comments and arguing and being like, hey, this is fake news. And somebody writes back and you're like, hey, no, I'm asking you to be civil here, you know, and you're kind of fighting the good fight. You're doing it for the best of intentions. Guess what Facebook takes away from that? They're like, oh, wow, this is helping this person spend more time on our site. Oh, wow, she's really interested in this content because she's engaging with them. And so they're showing you that story and you're in there arguing. And meanwhile, they're serving you up a story about, here's what's happening at the Board of Aldermen. And you're going, oh, I'm not angry about that. Maybe I'll get to that later. Well, guess what? Facebook is going to serve you up more of that same junk, and they're going to show it to other people. They're showing it to your friends because you have engaged with it. And maybe your friends aren't as adept as sorting out the truth from the fakery, and they're getting sucked into this story as opposed to what you're doing to try to combat it. So I would just encourage you, the more you can desist from engaging with sources that are not good, the better. The second thing is, I want to encourage you to just pay attention to real news. As I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking about how fewer local journalists there are still working, St. Louis is in many ways blessed in a way that places like Lorain, Ohio are not, in that we have, the Post-Dispatch is still going strong. They're publishing every day. They have a lot of good journalists. We still have the Riverfront Times that I'm proud to be associated with. A lot of cities, including New York City, have lost their alt weeklies. The Village Voice is no more. We still have the RFT. We have St. Louis Public Radio. We have KMOV. We have KTRS. We have the St. Louis Business Journal, a great publication, does amazing work. We have St. Louis Magazine. A lot of places have lost their city magazines. And here's the crazy part. I've now worked for a number of these publications, and I can tell you one thing that's true across the board is most of them are getting most of their traffic because they are posting their stories on Facebook or Twitter, and you guys are clicking in through there. Some of them get hardly any traffic through their own homepages. They have designed those homepages to be attractive to you. And in almost every case, they've designed them to be free. There's a lot of news on there. And so you're doom scrolling, you're on your phone, looking at Facebook, getting annoyed at what you see. Why not just pull up the website and read directly from the source? That's a way that you can actually get something that you can trust. And I think if you can find a way to just prioritize a little bit more caring about what's happening locally, I think that would be good for all of us. I think it's so easy to get distracted by, hey, I want to know what's happening with this desperate housewife, or I want to know what's happening with Alec Baldwin on the set of Rust. Yes, I guess it's very important that I stay up to date on all these tabloid stories. But can't I make a point to also carve out part of the time that I'm consuming on this sort of lightweight sort of national news to also make a point of getting some local news and getting it from good sources? And that then leads me to my third suggestion, and that is that I'm hoping that more people will be willing to pay for news, and specifically to pay for local news. And that, I think, brings us to a big question, and something that I've struggled with quite a bit in my professional career, and that is the idea of paywalls. The Post-Dispatch does have a paywall at this point. The Business Journal, which does amazing work, they have a pretty expensive paywall because they're doing such great work. That's how they've managed to pay the journalists who are behind it. And I would want to encourage you, if these are valuable news sources, yes, pay and get behind that paywall. I don't know that paywalls are sustainable for local news. I kind of am in the camp where I think they're not. There's a couple of reasons for that. We are not just competing, again, we are not just competing against other local outlets. We're competing against everything that is out there and free. And so maybe you're willing to spend your $20 a month to get access to the Post-Dispatch, but it's like for all the people who aren't, they're going to find lots of things to fill that same space, and it's not going to be the thing that educates them when it comes to democracy. The other problem that I really don't like about paywalls is they block the people who are most in need of information from accurate stories. I think about my nephew, who I'm still trying to get back on the correct path. I'm never, ever going to be able to get him at this point in his life to pay to get behind a paywall. But if a story is well researched and it's free, and it debunks the misinformation that he's getting, I have hope that in time, as this fine young man grows up, that he is going to find his way, and he's going to begin understanding a little bit more about the truth about the community around him. And so that's one reason that the publications that I've worked for, I've continued to fight for and believe that we should not have paywalls, that we need to do what we can to make these stories available to everybody. So if the solution isn't paywalls, and if we're fighting everybody for your time and attention all day long, how do we possibly get this to work? How do we get people to pay for local news when we know there's a whole bunch of people who would benefit from local news who don't necessarily want to pay for it? Well, there is a group of us here in St. Louis that is trying to do something about this. We've come to the conclusion that quality local journalism needs philanthropic support, just like libraries and zoos and the Symphony. I mean, there's a whole bunch of important civic institutions that are raising money all the time. They're not just making their operations work by selling tickets. They're not just relying on, yeah, we're going to charge $5 for everybody. They're saying, people who think this is important, we're asking you to put a little bit of money into this, to subsidize it, to help the common good here, the greater good. So we have formed a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our goal is to advance local journalism in St. Louis. Yes, thank you. Heather has put the URL for this organization there in the chat if anybody wants to check this out. It's called the River City Journalism Fund. This actually came out of an effort. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Richard Weiss, better known as Dick. He's a longtime St. Louis Post-Dispatch writer and then editor. And he had formed a nonprofit called Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, wanting to tell the stories about, in particular, the racial inequities in St. Louis. That became so apparent to so many people after what happened in Ferguson. And he found that he could commission these stories. He could pay the writers that were writing them using the money that he was able to raise just from working his own friends and connections. And then he could place these stories with local news outlets that didn't have the time and attention to do this level of quality work. And he would give it to the news outlets for free, and they would run it. So you could read these stories in the Riverfront Times, St. Louis Magazine, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And this was work that otherwise wouldn't have been done, that was being subsidized by philanthropic support. He had great success with the 63106 project. I don't know if any of you guys remember those stories, but he looked at the lives of people living in that zip code where they had a dramatically different quality of life from 63105 in Clayton, and was able to tell these stories in a way that today newspapers that are just chasing the big fire, we got to go to where the scandal is, we're all running over there like Bill McClellan used to make fun of the TV reporters for. Dick was able to pay them to do quality work, to actually spend time with people, to dig into the underlying causes. Yeah, someone says Dick Weiss is a local treasure. Kathleen, you're absolutely right about that. And so Dick Weiss and I and a couple other people began talking last year. And what we've now done is we've sort of merged some people who were hoping to start one of these nonprofit funding organizations with what Dick was doing. And we've now come together as the River City Journalism Fund. And what we're doing is we're just asking people for money. We've recently hired a development director. We're all just kind of getting started in this, but we're saying if local journalism is important to you, hey, maybe think about donating something to it. And the idea is we have a board of directors and they are going to disperse this money. I think initially we'll be paying for projects. Our big launch project this fall, we looked at St. Louis County's use of the death penalty and how 20 years later, that was finally shaking out as Attorney General Eric Schmidt fast-tracked some of these executions. And we looked at the racial disparities that went into that. And we looked at how that played out in some high-profile cases where people were being executed for what had happened under County Prosecutor Bob McCullough, who's no longer there, and how this was finally moving forward in this new era when McCullough had been ousted by voters. But the people who'd been executed or people who'd been given death sentences under his administration, that had finally worked its way through the court. So it was a nice in-depth, meaty project. We hope to raise enough money to commission more projects like that. We're hoping if we can really be successful, I'm surely getting ahead of myself here as I tend to do, but that we can also do paid internships, paid fellowships, maybe even paid staff positions, to have people covering some dedicated beats that are not currently being covered in St. Louis because newspapers just can't afford to devote a person to work full-time on those. We hope to give journalists time to work on more ambitious stories. We hope to free up some resources for these publications so that instead of struggling, they can begin to thrive again. It's ambitious. Who knows if we'll succeed, but I feel like we have a lot of smart people at the table who care a lot about this. Dick Weiss has proven that this model works. And now it's just a question of whether St. Louis decides to devote resources to it. You know, I feel like I have been extraordinarily lucky to go from getting to learn about Lorain, Ohio, realizing that this was not the armpit of America, but that this was a community where there were people that had devoted their lives to it. And there were people who were doing good public service. And then there were people maybe in these fast-growing suburbs who were trying to take advantage of the public coffers, but that this was a town that deserved attention. And I feel lucky that I've been able to go from that to working in Cleveland and Houston and Phoenix, Los Angeles, finally ending up in St. Louis. I'm now married to a St. Louis Louis in. I feel devoted to this town. I can't imagine myself going anywhere else. I'm raising my daughters here, care deeply about this town. People sometimes ask if the RFT will be here in 10 years. And I'll be honest, I don't know if the Post-Dispatch will be here in 10 years. And both of those things really scare me. You know, my hometown, Cleveland, there's no longer a daily newspaper there. They have a website, you know, the old Plain Dealer, and they continue to have reporters who are out there, but you can't get a paper delivered 7 days a week. I think this is probably where we're headed. If you can't get a newspaper delivered 7 days a week, can they afford to continue to have as many reporters as we're used to having in, say, St. Louis, working on that staff? Not unless something fundamentally changes. You know, and there's a bunch of us that would like to make things change, and we're going to need that change if we expect to continue to have watchdogs, if we expect to have coverage that helps us continue to understand the towns that we're in. You know, I've loved working in local news. I've loved getting to know St. Louis. I want to keep doing this, not just in 10 years, but in 20. I want to raise up the next generation of local journalists. I think this is the most fun job, as well as being an important job. And I would love for other people to get a chance to do it. And someday, I want to believe that some 22-year-old kid straight out of college will get assigned to a town that they had no intention of ever living in or working in. And they too will get to know that town. They'll get to see America, that they'll get paid a living wage so that they can pay close attention to that town and help explain that town to itself. And maybe they'll help send the corrupt mayor to jail. Maybe they'll write about the choir going to sing in New York City. Here's the best part of this fantasy. Maybe they'll meet another journalist from a rival newspaper covering the same meeting, because maybe at that point we'll have figured out the funding model for this, and there will again be multiple reporters from multiple papers covering these very important public meetings. Maybe they'll fall madly in love, and maybe, unlike my own, that marriage will actually last. So, might be a fantasy, but I like to believe. So I want to thank you all for hearing me out on all this. I feel like I just gave the world's longest monologue, and I know there are some questions here. And I'm going to try to address those, and I would love to try to address more. I think if you're able to raise your hand, I can probably see you and call on you. I see somebody here has done this. Oh, Ellen has done this. Awesome. And so, yeah, if you're able to like indicate that little thing, that'll be the best way for me to figure out that I can call on you next. I see Ellen also has a question here about the River City Journalism Fund. Will this organization do anything to help the underserved access the real news they need to get? Yeah, that is something that we are very focused on. One of the rules that we are going to have for anybody that takes this funding is that for the stories that are paid for with this funding, I'd say that we even place an intern at a paper that typically has a paywall, that they have to make that person's work freely available without the paywall. This has to be unpaywalled. So not only will those stories hopefully be shared between different publications so that we can get them out as broadly as we can, but that we'll also make sure that they are freely available. For that death penalty series, it ran in the Riverfront Times, it ran in St. Louis Public Radio, KCUR, the Kansas City Public Radio station picked it up and ran it as well, which was great. NPR actually put one of our stories on their homepage, which was huge. And then the St. Louis Jewish Light ran it. Ellen Futterman and Betsy Schmidt, the CEO over there, they've been great partners in this effort. And so they also put it on their website, which is also freely available. So that's part of the goal there. Ellen, I see you still have your hand up. Is there a different question, or was that the question?
Well, just as a follow-up, Sarah, is the whole issue of equity and access to news for people that need it most, who don't even know where to go to get real news.
Yeah,
because they're so used to getting it from all these other sites.
yeah.
How do we educate folks about where best to go?
Yeah, I think that's also an important piece of this. And part of what the fund is working on, we have 3 committees, one to raise money, one to spend it on journalism. And then the third committee is the Community Stories Committee. And what we're hoping to do is to create more and deeper connections with the kind of communities that Dick was initially so passionate about covering the stories of, that 63106 project, for example. And so the idea is that we wouldn't just put these things on websites and hope people stumble into them, but that we would be doing community events where we would come to people's neighborhoods, with their invitation, but that we would work to get that invitation and we could come to a space where they're comfortable, that we would listen to them. And that we would also hopefully have somebody who's worked on the project maybe present a little bit about it. You know, I'm such a sucker for the written word. That's how I best digest information. I understand that many people today are much happier watching short videos. They want to hear people explain the news to them in almost like a first person manner, as opposed to it being something they read. I want to make sure that these stories that we commission and as we're covering beats, that we're finding a way to get it in that format as well, because I think that is the future. As much as old school people like me find ourselves being innately judgmental about that, I think that's something that we need to get over. You know, oral storytelling is something that long predates print newspapers and the written word. And I think if we can get people the news that way, I think that's great as well. Jen, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah. Yes, I'm one of those actual journalism majors who ended up not going into journalism.
Probably
But,
smart.
but we do know, you know, Mizzou has one of the top journalism schools in the country, and there are other fine schools around the country. Are they doing anything to prepare their students for this new landscape and how to navigate all this, or are they just doing, you know, status quo that you know of?
Yeah. I think they're trying really hard. I do need to give them credit on this. You know, that journalism school has stayed on top because they have innovated. They just do amazing work there. Every time I tell people, I'm in St. Louis now, oh, you must get great hires out of Mizzou. I'm like, yes, we frequently do. And then in other cases, the New York Times steals them away and we can't even hire them. I think they're very focused on teaching people these new mediums. You know, teaching people how to do video, teaching people how to get the news out on different platforms. Like, yeah, you should be on TikTok. Here's how you can actually do that. You know, when I was starting out, it was all like, oh, you'd have a designated photographer to go with you on a story. That's a luxury that they don't have. And Mizzou, I think, was ahead of the curve in terms of teaching people how to shoot their own stories. Now they're ahead of the curve in terms of teaching them things like podcasting. A lot of people get their news from podcasting, teaching them about video. They seem to come out really like all over the multimedia thing. I think where they may struggle, and this is just my perception, I haven't spent time there, I think it's where everybody kind of struggles. It's very hard. There's just not quite enough solid paying jobs in journalism. And I think they're training people for something that it's so important to be trained for, but like the funding model that is going to keep those people being able to do that work down the road is, it ends up creating a real hardship. And so they're great in that they have placed a lot of people in these bigger national publications, and that I think is going well. But in terms of the people who used to be able to go from there to spending, you know, a couple years at a small daily newspaper and then working their way to the Post-Dispatch and knowing that they could spend the next 30 years at the Post-Dispatch and raise a family in St. Louis, that's what's changed. You know, the Post-Dispatch wants to hire the kid right out of college. They want to pay them not that much because it's what they can afford, and they count on them leaving in just a couple of years. And if they want to stay in journalism, they often have to leave town. So I see there's a couple comments here that I'll go through. Feel free to raise your hand if you want. I don't see anybody currently with a hand raised, but if I'm missing you, feel free to jump in here. Nancy says, getting better broadband throughout Missouri would help. Two issues: need to have access in the rural areas and need to afford in urban areas. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I know this is a story when I was at St. Louis Public Radio that we tried to cover pretty aggressively, that there seemed to be a lot of efforts towards trying to make broadband happen in rural areas. And it was always just very frustrating to know that they had not yet figured that out, and that we haven't figured out better internet access for places here in St. Louis where people might not have the money for it. So I think that's a completely related problem that unfortunately probably also needs to be addressed by an equally high energy group of people. So.
Sarah, I see that Susan has her hand up.
Oh, great. Yes, Susan.
Oh, Susan, you're muted.
Hi, yeah, this is not exactly to the point, but did you realize that the internet and also the technology for smartphones were invented by, or were invented by two St. Louisans who started out together at the Wilson School and then were students together at John boroughs right here in St. Louis. They grew up in St. Louis, and I'm actually the few women engineers who worked at the Army Missile Command in Huntsville, Alabama. And it's because of the work I did at on precision guided weapons in 1988, before the Berlin Wall came down. I worked with TRW and the 94 gigahertz semiconductor devices that they were doing before
Yeah.
anyone else was doing.
Susan, I'm just going to cut in here. I think that's great. And yeah, without that infrastructure, it would be impossible.
I tried to make people aware of this on St. Louis on the Air, and no one would talk to me.
Yes, I remember you did send us a couple letters about that. And yeah,
my classmate was David Clark, who invented the internet. He and I grew up together in St. Louis, and I think people in St. Louis should be aware of this. If I could talk to you about this later, I think it's very important that St. Louisans know that we did this.
Yeah. I think that's an important story. I think it kind of goes back to some of what I'm been talking about today. Is unfortunately
I came in late because I couldn't get Zoom to work on my computer. I've been having a whole lot of trouble with that.
Yeah,
but
I think that the real problem in local news is not that there's no absence of stories that we can and should cover. Every story that we make a decision to cover, we're choosing not to cover something else. And as I scrolled over to see Susan's face, I see Mike Fitzgerald is here. Mike is a reporter that I have the distinct pleasure of working with and editing. Mike has just put in so much.
I just got an award from the Wilson School for being an alum award for the work I did. I just got that on Saturday night, and I went there in 1949. But I think people should be aware that it was St. Louisans that did this. David, got his invented the internet, and I think St. Louisans should be aware that we grew up in St. Louis and we did that work.
Yeah.
I see another question in the chat from MJ. Any advice on time management?
Let me, I'll get to that in a sec. I did want to finish the point I was making about Mike. Sorry, because I began to give Mike a
Yeah, absolutely.
so Mike has just done some terrific work exposing what has been going on in one of our local school districts, in the Hazelwood School District. He's not only working on the radioactive issue, but he's been working on how they have sort of turned over to a for-profit company a lot of the daily education of students. And so it was frankly a horrifying story that Mike did a great job of spending a lot of time getting to the bottom to. And so as an editor, I'm just almost overwhelmed by how many big, complicated stories are out there and the sort of choices you have to make of, do you dig into this history? Do you dig into this present? Where do you put the energies? Mike, I don't know if you want to just speak briefly to this, but I feel like there's probably 20 stories you could work on full time right now, and you are one guy.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So first off, I want to just say what a special treat and privilege it is to be able to work with someone like Sarah. I mean,
Mike,
this
is not what we need to talk about.
Well, I know it's not mutual admiration, but the thing is, she is such an asset to this community. So, and we need more people like her, younger folks. I've been in the business for a long time, and I can tell you that there is a lot to look at, and there are tremendous stories here. And it's almost like a reporter's theme park. So, but we just need that encouragement. And I was talking to a young journalist a couple of weeks ago who asked me for some advice about a story. And he's going to a journalism school on the East Coast. And, he's full of fire and just really enthusiastic, but doesn't know how he can make a living. And I told him, I don't know how you can either, but the work's so important. You got to get into it, and you just got to follow your heart.
Yeah.
And that is so incredibly important right now, because the need for great journalism that does its job without fear or favor has never been greater. It's never been greater. So, when people like Sarah encouraging folks like me, it makes it a lot easier to do. That's all I got to say.
Well, Mike, as always,
Uh,
you are too kind. Mike is just a great example of somebody who's working so hard on these stories without the kind of pay that he should be getting for these stories. And we are lucky he devoted his time to it.
our community needs it.
Yeah. And I love that, he has that real service perspective. MJ has a great question here. Any advice on time management? On any given day, I do the following, and it can get stressful. I ditched social media in 2014 with the exception of Nextdoor. She says, I browse KSDK, KMOV, and Fox 2, etc. Then in my inbox, I browse daily emails for stories I want to follow from the KC Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Business Journal, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Those daily emails are gold. I also watch PBS NewsHour in the eve. Also listens to a lot of radio, including NPR and the BBC. So that's about 1 to 2 hours of reading, 1 to 2 hours listening or watching. MJ is very informed and treats it like a school project. And as MJ points out, that's just not doable for so many people. And MJ, I think if we had more people like you taking this so seriously, we would not be in the mess that we're in. So thank you so much. I am just really heartening to see somebody who understands that keeping ourselves educated is a project. And yeah, I mean, I have 2 little kids and a full-time job. I get it. I'm also find myself again, just doom scrolling on my phone at night when I'm tired, as opposed to seeking out those quality New York Times stories that are there in my own inbox. So I guess I would say there might be seasons of your life when you maybe don't have time to stay up on everything. Maybe just choose a couple of things. It might be that you want to keep an eye on national politics and that you've decided, I really care about what's going on in my local school board. I'm going to try to pay attention to this, or I want to pay attention to what's happening with that Wildwood school district. There were so many things I read about 6 months ago in the Post-Dispatch that I'm upset about. I'm going to stay on top of this story and set a Google News alert for that. I think, just staying on a story after other people have moved on is often just a really good practice we can do. And I think if you can just find an outlet or 2 that you really respect and make a point of reading them at least once a week, you don't have to know everything about everything, but it's important just to give yourself that education that you can. Somebody had commented earlier on this, Carla had said she also makes a point to pick up the St. Louis American. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Carla. I did not mean to not mention them. They do terrific work. Actually, our latest River City Journalism Fund story is right now running on the St. Louis American website. It has to do, it's a young man who's written it about some of the pro soccer experience. And he's a young man who's come from an impoverished community, is here with a special scholarship at Wash U. And he really wants to cover soccer because culturally that's very important to him. And so we're providing some funding so he can do this as an intern and have that placed in places like the St. Louis American that might be interested in soccer, but can't afford to have a soccer writer. And so I think they're a great outlet, and it's amazing that they too are still going strong, even in these difficult headwinds. Let's see. So Lee says, I agree with Carla about the St. Louis American, which I read as often as I can. I'd put the Light in the same category. Do you agree that these outlets are also doing genuine journalism? Absolutely. Yeah. The American sometimes has a strong perspective to its stories. I come from the Riverfront Times. I believe in a strong perspective in those stories. I could give you a whole nother talk about how I don't believe anybody can be fully 100% objective, that each reporter is subjective in their own way. It's one reason I think it's so good to have 2 reporters on the same beat. You can sometimes find the truth in and between the stories that they're writing. And so the perspective that the St. Louis American has, I find that so vital. The Jewish Light, I find their work so vital. And I think we should all be trying to make time to read more sources like that and not just something like the Post-Dispatch. So Heather says, let's see, even quality publications like New York Times do problematic things. They have been delving into some anti-trans slants recently. Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to get your news from a variety of sources. You just want to make sure your sources are not inventing things like litter boxes for kids in classrooms. You want to make sure that you might think that the New York Times is covering a story in a really bad way. Find a publication that's covering that story with real journalism, that's out there talking to people, that's doing a better job with it, as opposed to just sort of giving up and being at the mercy of celebrity news. The opinion sections can get real interesting between the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, says MJ. And yeah, that's so interesting. I love to read them both on the same day. And is this happening in the same world? I think it's important to get those different perspectives. So, any other questions or comments? If I've said something that you disagree with, that's fair. I'd welcome it. No. All right. Well, I'm happy to let y'all go. If anybody has anything else they want to talk about here.
Well, Sarah, we
Okay.
can, oh, Heather, did you?
The only thing I was gonna add is that I also sit on a local city council, and pre-COVID, we always had someone from the Post-Dispatch at our meetings, and post-COVID, we haven't, meaning most of my colleagues now are not used to sitting on the dais with reporters in the audience, taking notes on what they say. And the difference in decorum and being thoughtful about their remarks it's a difference.
Wow. Heather, you've seen that shift so quickly. I mean, this isn't like they've gone 10 years without people paying attention to them. I've long suspected this to be true. So thank you for confirming it for me, because when I'm there as a journalist and I never get to see what it's like when I'm not there. And that, it really worries me. You know, I like to see a little more decorum. So I'm sorry.
Could I make a comment, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I would welcome that.
One of the things I think is very important in this era is the fact that our community, our readers, are never been more vital. Whenever I write a story, I get tips from all kinds of people for follow-up stories, or for other kinds of stories. So it's like the Baker Street Irregulars and Sherlock Holmes. We need our public to help us now more than ever. We don't have the dedicated staffs, the resources. But in some ways, this is more exciting because there's more participation now from the public
Yeah.
to help to kind of crowdsource great journalism. And you see it all over. Crowdsourcing great journalism. It's happening now. So we need you, the public, to help us to uncover the truth and demand accountability. So thank you.
Yeah, Mike, you said it better than I could ever say it. And that might be a great note to end on. So thank you all. It's been great to just get to wax on and on about my very favorite subjects. So I appreciate you guys giving me this platform. And if I can ever, answer follow-up questions, if you want to know any more about what we're trying to do with this fund, feel free to reach out directly. I'm happy to come talk to any group that wants to hear more about the fund. So don't hesitate, hit me up. And yeah, if you've got good story ideas, I'll probably be sending them straight to Mike. But there are reporters that are still out there and they're aggressive and they want to get to the truth. And that's what gives me faith. So thank you.
Well, Sarah, I cannot thank you enough. This was really informative and interesting and, dare I say, fun. And I think everyone really appreciates what you're doing and what journalists are doing. In your honor for speaking today, NCJW St. Louis has made a donation to the fund. So we wanted to thank you, for doing this for us. And hopefully we can, help in our little way. I did want to make a couple of announcements before we wrap up. Please remember to join us again for our Lunch and Learn in March, which is March 16th on a Thursday. And our speaker is actually in here. It's Nicole Gorofsky. And we are so excited to have her speak about the courts and how much courts matter. I think there's this misnomer that everything happens in the Supreme Court, and really most things do not. And we don't know a lot about federal courts and other lower courts. So Nicole is kind of one of the foremost experts on this issue. And she did a presentation for the NCJW board a few weeks ago, and it was incredible. And I learned so much. And I think everyone will really benefit from this too. So we are very excited to welcome her. NCJW, for those of you who don't know, is also having a conference. It's a national conference on basically how to navigate legislatively and in advocacy in challenging states like Missouri. So we have people coming in from all over the country. It will be March 3rd through 5th at the Sheraton Westport. And I'm going to send a follow-up email out to everyone with a survey that you can fill out about, on this Lunch and Learn or an evaluation. And I will put the link if you are interested in attending all of that or just parts of it. We would love to have you. And we do have financial aid if anyone is interested. And also, finally, make sure to sign up for our weekly 5 ways to advocate if you haven't already done so. And it kind of ties in nicely with this subject because we always put in an article in there, we put it under the name interesting reading. And I always try to find articles from, independent sources and sources who are really doing good work and, not falling victim to fake news and just unimportant issues that we're all following today. So that is a component of our 5 ways to advocate, but also it gives you easy ways to be an advocate. There might be hearings coming up that we want you to contact your legislators about, or there might be just an action you can take or a program you can attend. So you can just shoot me an email back after I send out that evaluation and let me know if you would like to sign up if you haven't done so already. And that's about it. Nicole, do you have anything to add before we sign off?
Nothing other than just saying thank you so much, Sarah, for being here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much and have a great weekend. Take care.